Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the fifth lecture in the Royal Armouries 2024 to 5 Winter Lecture Series. I'm Mark Bennett, I'm the museum's research manager. Thank you very much for joining us today. The Royal Armouries is the UK's national collection of arms and armour. It started life at a medieval stockpile of weapons at the Tower of London, but by the early 19th century it was regularly open to the public. Much, it has to be said, to the consternation of the then Constable of the Tower, the Duke of Wellington. Wellington was convinced that revolutionaries were going to infiltrate the Tower, posing as tourists, and then seize the weapons there, held there to wage a civil war against the British state. Fortunately, that scenario didn't come to pass before the middle of the 19th century, which was when we ceased being a functional arsenal and started being a museum. We now operate across 3 sites, our home here in Leeds, historic home at the Tower of London, and Fort Nelson down at Portsmouth. These talks form part of our mission to promote the public's understanding and enjoyment of arms and armour. They take place roughly every 2 weeks, generally in person here at the museum and online. In addition, they're generally available to watch after the event on YouTube. So just to bring together some technical matters before we start. Yes. So after today's talk, we'll take questions from the people here at the museum, from the Zoom Q&A function, and from the YouTube chat. If you're submitting them online, feel free to send them as soon as they occur to you. If people here can keep their hands down until the end of the talk, that would be appreciated. If you're online and you'd find it helpful, you can add captions using the CC button on both Zoom and YouTube. After the talk, if you wouldn't mind sending us feedback, that would again be very much appreciated. If you have a QR code scanner, you can pause the beginning and end slides. If not, I will drop a link in the chat on both Zoom and YouTube. We are very glad to hear what you have to say. We are trying something different with the staging today. So if it improves the experience, if there's stuff that we should bear in mind, please let us know. But with all those technical factors out of the way, let me introduce today's speaker. The museum collection features many weapons which are masterpieces of Victorian technological design. The 7-inch Armstrong gun, the machine-made interchangeable Enfield rifle, and indeed Fort Nelson itself. However, not everyone was on board with either the human cost of these armaments or the financial costs. Today, then, we're joined by Professor Simon Morgan of Leeds Beckett University, who will explain the peace activism of the Victorian campaigner and MP, Richard Cobden. Without any further ado, over to you, Simon.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. It's a great pleasure to be here. And speaking on my favourite subject, which is Richard Cobden, the chap that you can see on the slide here. But for those of you who aren't necessarily as familiar with Cobden as myself, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about who he was and why he became such a well-known figure in Victorian Britain and afterwards. Well, he was the son of a Sussex farmer down in Midhurst, who later became a Manchester manufacturer of calico cotton goods. He made a name for himself as a Victorian pamphleteer. He published a couple of pamphlets in the middle of the 1830s on Britain's international relations. The first of them, England, Ireland, and America, and the second, Russia, or a cure for the Russophobia, an intervention, as it says on the tin, in Anglo-Russian relations. But he's most well known as being the leader of the Anti-Corn Law League, which was created in Manchester in 1839 to coordinate the activities of anti-corn law associations across the country. And the League, again, did what it said on the tin. It campaigned against the corn laws, which were import duties on grain and other foodstuffs. The League, including Cobden, held them responsible for keeping food prices artificially high and also for lining the pockets of the aristocracy, who were able to continue to charge high rents on their land to their tenant farmers. The Corn Laws had been introduced, of course, or strengthened at the end of the Napoleonic Wars when Britain was facing an influx of cheap foodstuffs from the continent, and there were concerns that this might drive British farmers to the wall. Many of them had overextended themselves during the war as food prices were high, and also threatened the basis of Britain's landed constitution. But its critics held it responsible for driving food prices up and making life extremely difficult for the poor, particularly in the late 1830s and the early 1840s at a time of great economic depression. The Leaguers also believed that the Corn Laws were a drag on international trade, that by putting high tariffs on corn imported from the United States and from Russia, those countries would retaliate by imposing high tariffs on British manufactured goods, retarding the growth of British manufacturers and putting people out of work in Lancashire and elsewhere. Cobden became an MP in 1841. He was elected for Stockport in Cheshire, and he held that seat until 1847. In the general election of that year, he was actually abroad. When to his horror, he found out that he'd been elected in absentia for the West Riding of Yorkshire. So he actually represented the area, including Leeds, from 1847 until 1857. Why with horror? Well, partly because, or mainly because, the West Riding of Yorkshire constituency was vast. It was geographically the largest English constituency, and in population, I think it was only outdone by Middlesex. So it was a huge area to take notice of. It included all of modern West Yorkshire, pretty much, the vast majority of modern South Yorkshire, and a good slice of modern North Yorkshire thrown in as well. So it covered a huge area and many major towns, including Leeds and Sheffield. In 1847, he was defeated. I'll say a bit more about that a bit later when he stood for Huddersfield, and he then came back into Parliament for Rochdale in 1859, and he served there until his death in 1865. And Cobden gave his name, though, to a system of political economic thought that becomes, badged as Cobdenism, which is a key feature of liberal economic policy and financial policy through to the end of the 19th century, and also has an influence on early Labour Party economic policy and financial policy as well. But the Anti-Corn Law League wasn't Cobden's only interest. He actually came into politics around the campaign for education. He became an anti-imperialist troublemaker and the friend of America. But probably the campaign that he stuck at longest, apart from perhaps education, was that for international peace. So unlike many, I'll just bob back there. So unlike many modern day exponents of free trade who tend to focus on wealth creation and economic growth, Cobden saw free trade as a means to an end. And it was about improving the relations between countries, increasing trade so that war would become unthinkable and impractical and lead to the establishment of universal peace. And that's what I'm really going to be focusing on in today's lecture. I just want to spend a couple of minutes, though, thinking about a project that I've been involved in pretty much all my professional life since 2002, which is the publication of the letters of Richard Cobden. I started off as a lowly research officer at the London School of Economics in 2002 on the Letters of Richard Cobden project run by Professor Anthony Howe. And we produced, over the period 2007 to 2015, 4 hard copy volumes of Cobden's selected letters. But that still left 5,500 letters that we transcribed but couldn't get published because Oxford University Press refused to publish that many. So eventually in 2023, we got funding to produce an online version of the letters where we were able to publish the remaining 5,500 transcripts. And these are freely available on www.cobdenletters.org. So please do go and check those out. As well as the letters, there are explanatory essays and also some resources for teaching citizenship and history at Key Stage 3 in secondary schools. So, to carry on, though, with Cobden and the peace movement. So for Cobden, the real significance of free trade was as a means of achieving universal peace. A similar ideal, of course, emerged from the rubble of the Second World War, underpinning the modern European Union's goal of ever closer union. But peace was only part of the story. Reducing import taxes would also necessarily reduce government expenditure, most of which at this time was still spent on the military. And this intersected with Cobden's other aim, which was to loosen the stranglehold of the British aristocracy on the nation's political and social life. The campaign against the Corn Laws was part of this, shifting economic policy away from protecting the interests of those who owned vast landed estates and towards promoting manufactures. Cobden saw the armed services as particularly implicated in the system of aristocratic rule, thanks to the law of primogeniture. With only the eldest son inheriting land and titles, there was a need to ensure a steady supply of commissions in the army and navy to mop up the surplus younger sons and give them a status and income commensurate with their birth. Cobden believed that this created a continual pressure from the landed elite, who still dominated Parliament even after the Great Reform Act of 1832, to keep the army and navy budgets artificially high. And it could even represent an incentive towards war as a way of increasing the number of available commissions. So in 1846 and 47, one of his first acts after the repeal of the Corn Laws was to tour the European capitals as the apostle of free trade. His aim was to persuade rulers such as King Louis Philippe of France, Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, and Pope Pius IX to institute free trade reforms in their territories. Hopes of such liberalisation, though, were largely dashed by the bloody suppression of the revolutions of 1848. But in the initial optimistic afterglow of those eruptions, alongside such luminaries as the novelist Victor Hugo and the scientist Alexander von Humboldt, Cobden became one of the leading celebrities of the international peace movement. At this time, this took the form of a succession of meetings or congresses in cities such as Brussels, Paris, Frankfurt, and Edinburgh between 1848 and 1853. So on the slide, you have an image from the Illustrated London News of Victor Hugo addressing the Paris Peace Congress in 1849, where he outlined a vision of a future United States of Europe, strikingly anticipating the modern-day European Union. According to David Nichols, Cobden's main contribution to the Peace Congress movement was to move what could have been just a talking shop towards a more practical set of measures that might actually just bring about the end of war. So these included the use of arbitration to settle international disputes, disarmament, non-intervention in the affairs of other nations, and the abolition of war loans. The latter two took aim in particular at the role of Russia in suppressing the national revolutions in Hungary and Poland, which had been financed by a war loan raised in London. Cobden pushed this programme not just through his own interventions at the congresses, but also through constant correspondence with leading figures in the movement. Now, unfortunately, despite initial public enthusiasm, Cobden's involvement in the peace movement saw him spectacularly fall from public favour. When the Crimean War broke out with Russia, many liberals enthusiastically supported the war effort in the belief that a defeat for Russia would be a victory in the national liberation struggles in Hungary and Poland. The principled opposition of Cobden and his associate John Bright lost them public support, although Bright did seal his reputation as a powerful and effective parliamentary orator at this time through interventions such as his famous Angel of Death speech following the Battle of the Alma. One of Cobden's correspondents in the 1850s was a man called Henry Richard, later notable as a leading Welsh Liberal MP, but at the time the secretary of the Peace Society and editor of its newspaper, the Herald of Peace. Cobden sent numerous articles and ideas for articles to Richard to include in the Herald, and continued to do so once Richard became the editor of the Morning Star, established as a vehicle for Cobdenite ideas in 1855, no relation to the present-day newspaper of that name. In In this letter from January 1856, Cobden attempts to use the Star to pursue the latest round of a long-running battle with the Times by attempting to expose the role it played in promoting and maintaining the war with Russia over the Crimea. Could you spend a few pounds better than in paying somebody whose heart was in the work to go through a file of it and bring out matter enough to expose the rashness, inconsistency, and dishonesty of that print? First, it should be fixed with the authorship of the expedition to the Crimea, of which it boasted, you may recollect, after the fall of the South Side. Then how it misled the people as to the meaning of the Treaty of December with Austria and the certainty of that power joining the Allies. Then, in the disgusting flattery of the people and the equally loathsome boasting of our power, and the most dangerous deprecations of the resources of our enemy. Tidbits of this sort would be certain to be used in the House of Commons, when the Times must report. So the Times reported verbatim many of the debates in the House of Commons at this time. So by getting people to actually quote against it in the House of Commons, Cobden was hoping the paper would be forced to actually report that. Cobden's peace principles eventually cost him his seat in Parliament in 1857. Having succeeded in passing a motion of censure on Palmerston's government for the bombardment of the Chinese port of Canton by the Royal Navy, Cobden and many of his Manchester School colleagues found themselves on the receiving end of an electoral drubbing when Palmerston decided to vindicate his aggressive foreign policy by calling a general election. Having alienated the West Riding Liberals, particularly Edward Baines of the Leeds Mercury, which had supported the Crimean War, Cobden decided to step down from his West Riding seat and stand instead for the borough of Huddersfield. There he was defeated by Edward Ackroyd of Halifax, another Liberal candidate and an erstwhile anti-Corn Law campaigner. Now, interestingly, during the Crimean War, Cobden had actually attended a peace meeting in Leeds, where he was opposed by Edward Baines. But he reported to his wife that he was cheered through the streets by the inhabitants, because although they disagreed with his stance on the Crimean War, they appreciated his bravery in turning up to defend it in person. Now, the Canton incident brings us to another closely related aspect of Cobden's thought, his opposition to colonialism. Pointing to the wrong thing. Yes, I am. Okay. Right back to the letters that he wrote during his tour of the Mediterranean in 1836, Cobden had seen the colonies in much the same light as he saw the army and navy, essentially a job creation scheme for the younger sons of the aristocracy. By the 1850s, though, he also saw colonial possessions as a potential source of friction between the great powers, and an arena where functionaries on the ground could misuse the power of the British state in pursuit of their own petty or venal ends. In 1853, he explored the latter in a pamphlet, How Wars Are Got Up in India, tracing the origin of the Burmese War to the petty ambition and pride of Commodore Lambert. Lambert, as Cobden explained, was dispatched to Rangoon with instructions to investigate complaints from certain British subjects about the governor of that place, but with strict instructions from the Governor-General of India not to engage in hostilities. Cobden described in detail how Lambert routinely exceeded his instructions, culminating in the seizure of a Burmese ship and the declaration of a blockade of the whole Burmese coast. Thanks to the defeat at Huddersfield, Cobden was out of Parliament during the period of the Great Indian Rebellion of 1857-8, commonly known as the Indian Mutiny. This rebellion involved atrocities against European soldiers and civilians, most notoriously the massacre of 120 women and children at Campur. News of this provoked demands for revenge in the British press, and the troops that were dispatched to restore British rule duly obliged, committing their own massacres of civilians and prisoners, as well as torturing rebels. In Oud alone, it's been estimated that 150,000 Indians died, around 2/3 of them civilians. Cobden was relieved that he was spared the exhausting duty of opposing this bloodlust in Parliament, but his private correspondence leaves no doubt as to his feelings on the subject. To John Bright and Henry Richard, he put forward his view that God would eventually take his own retribution for Britain's aggression in the East. While deploring the atrocity at Campur to Bright, he pointed out that the British had themselves been the original aggressors in India and elsewhere. And as he put it to Joseph Sturge, it does not deprive a whole people of its rights, because a comparatively few commit deeds which deserve extreme punishment. If so, what would be our fate? The painting behind me, by the way, illustrating Britain's retribution against India, is in the Leeds City Art Gallery. And you've got clear sort of reference there to the Kanpur massacre in the imagery around the two allegorical figures of Britannia and the tiger. Moving back to Europe, though, one of the recurring themes in Cobden's peace campaigning was the often fraught relationship between Britain and France. France was the great power that dominated much of British military planning and expenditure in this period. This shouldn't be surprising. As well as being Britain's closest neighbour, Britain had spent most of the century before 1815 at war with France for one reason or another. The election in 1848 of Louis Napoleon, nephew of the great Emperor Napoleon, as president of the Second French Republic, made veteran soldiers such as the Duke of Wellington nervous. The Duke of Wellington often got nervous, as we've just heard, in his fears about opening the Tower of London. And actually, his nerves drove quite a lot of the sort of subsequent invasion panics that swept Britain over the succeeding years. At one point, Cobden was fulminating that the Duke of Wellington was convinced that the French invasion fleet would suddenly appear off Beachy Head, which Cobden found frankly implausible given the topography of Beachy Head, which anybody who's been there can attest to. So the nervousness in Britain about France only increases after Napoleon has himself made emperor in 1851. For the rest of Cobden's life, there were periodic invasion panics, often used by Lord Palmerston's government to justify increases in military expenditure. So Cobden spent a lot of time and effort trying to debunk these panics, including his pamphlet 1793 and 1853, written during the invasion scare of the latter year, where he attempted to demonstrate that it was British, not French aggression that had led to her involvement in the long wars with revolutionary and Napoleonic France. And he followed this up in 1862 with another pamphlet entitled The Three Panics, which recommended France and Britain negotiate on naval disarmament to diffuse their damaging and costly naval rivalry. So it was that when Cobden was returned to Parliament for the borough of Rochdale in 1859, again in absentia, he was actually in America on a tour of America at the time, and he knew nothing about his election until he got off the boat at Liverpool and was met by cheering crowds and the news that he'd been elected for Rochdale. So one of his first acts was to go and seek out the Chancellor of the Exchequer, William Ewart Gladstone, at his Hordern estate near Chester, in order to seek his blessing for a mission to France to lay the foundations of a commercial treaty designed to increase trade between those two countries and thereby increase mutual trust and understanding. The plan had originally been suggested to Cobden by his friend, the French economist Michel Chevalier, and it becomes known as the Cobden-Chevalier Treaty. And Cobden puts this into action in November 1859, managing to arrange a preliminary treaty by the 23rd of January. Now, after the Brexit vote, and well, actually after actual Brexit, after we left the European Union, people started to dust off the Cobden-Chevalier Treaty and said, well, look, how hard can it be? Cobden managed to negotiate this treaty in France in a couple of weeks. Surely the establishing free trade treaties with the world can't be that difficult. Well, there's two answers to that. One is that the world is a heck of a lot more complicated a place now than it was in 1859. And the second is that it didn't just take Cobden a few weeks. To arrange the kind of basic outline of the treaty was achieved very quickly. But this first triumph was merely the prelude to what Cobden later described as the most intense labour of his life, the negotiation of the individual duties on a vast range of industrial goods and produce. This took months, only being completed in November 1860, and it required the service of a small army of experts in various trades, many drawn from Cobden's circle of acquaintance in Manchester and beyond, and many of them making it into this commemorative engraving on the slide. It's Chevalier is the man stood with the scroll, and Cobden is seated to his left as you look at the image. The work was complicated by the fact that during his stay in France, yet another invasion scare was in full swing, the subject of much bellicose rhetoric in Parliament and the English newspapers. It's small wonder then that Cobden began to feel his work was being deliberately undermined. As he complained to Thomas Milner Gibson, now president of the Board of Trade, an erstwhile anti-Corn Law leaguer and MP for Manchester, in a letter of 30th September 1860. I am nearly worried to death with stupidities of all kinds at home. All the foul play, annoyance, lies, and obstacles I have had to encounter from the first have come from your side of the Channel. And now the delays of the Circumlocution Office, i.e. the Foreign Office, nearly drive me mad. Extraordinarily, in a bid to demonstrate their good faith and reflecting the trust they had in Cobden personally, the French government granted Cobden the run of the naval dockyards at Toulon so that he could send home detailed accounts of the French ships on the stocks there in an attempt to prove that the accounts of the French constructing an invasion fleet were wildly exaggerated. Back home in England, meanwhile, Cobden was appalled by Palmerston's huge expenditure as what he saw as useless or worse, even shameful land defences, especially those at Portsmouth, a short distance from his residence in West Sussex. One of these, of course, Fort Nelson, is now another branch of the Royal Armouries Museum, housing the national collection of artillery pieces. Using his contacts in the military, Cobden set about surveying the scene for himself and gathering the opinions of officers. These were not complimentary. As Cobden saw it, and I quote, "There is not an officer of either service with a head on his shoulders, under 50, that does not look with supreme contempt, disgust, and humiliation on these works, based as they were on the assumption, of course, that the Royal Navy had already been bested at sea by the French and that a French army was rampaging unmolested through the British countryside, while, as Cobden pointed out, the British army was sheltering behind their new fortifications." So, yeah. So this brings us to Cobden's interest in the Navy and in naval technology. First of all, I should provide some context for this as well, not just in Anglo-French relations, but also in Anglo-American relations. Cobden, as I mentioned at the start of the lecture, becomes known as the friend of America, which rests on the support that Cobden and Bright in particular expressed for the American federal government during the American Civil War, at a time when British public opinion was at best ambivalent towards both sides, the North and the South, and at worst, as it was perceived, particularly in the north of America, at worst sympathetic towards the Confederacy. And the key issue, of course, was Britain's cotton supply. The American Civil War led to the Union states blockading the Confederate ports, preventing cotton from reaching the market in Lancashire, leading to what becomes known as the cotton famine. Once the stockpiles had been exhausted, there's no, the new cotton coming in is reduced to a trickle, and you end up with mills running on short time or closing down altogether, throwing large numbers of people out of work. And Cobden was very active, actually, in the relief effort. In fact, he did a lot to galvanize what had been quite a sort of moribund and tepid campaign, coming in and really sort of rousing the local manufacturers to action. And as he put it, sending the begging bowl through the whole kingdom to try to support the cotton workers. But in America, the things that kind of stood out most were the support of Cobden and Bright for peace and for keeping Britain out of the Civil War at moments of tension, including, for example, the so-called Trent Affair, when the Confederate envoys, Mason and Slidell, were seized on board a Royal Navy, no, not a Royal Navy, on board a mail packet, I think it was, coming from America. And this led to calls for British intervention. Palmerston sends troops to Canada. There's all sorts of bellicose going on before the Americans finally backed down. And Cobden and Bright played a role in helping keep Lincoln's cabinet informed of the state of public opinion around this time. And there are other interventions too. Cobden in particular becomes involved in helping to prevent the so-called Laird rams that were being built at Laird's shipyard in Birkenhead from escaping and becoming part of the Confederate Navy, as the Alabama had done previously to that as well. So Cobden is aware of the developments that are going on in naval warfare, particularly as a result of the American Civil War, partly through his interest in the conflict and his desire to keep Britain out of it. So when he goes to look at the fortifications in Portsmouth, he's accompanied by two naval officers, Captain Cowper Coles and Colonel Williams of the Marine Artillery. Cowper Coles was the inventor of the so-called cupola ship with revolving turret-mounted guns, which heralded a revolution in warship design. There was already a revolution in warship design underway, particularly with the launch of the French ironclad warship La Gloire, which had been one of the causes of the invasion panic that started in 1859. Because suddenly all of the Royal Navy's wooden-hulled warships were obsolete because they were faced with this new ironclad threat. During the American Civil War, the US Navy developed its own Monitor-class ships with iron hulls and revolving turrets, as shown in the illustration here. And it demonstrated their destructive power, particularly against traditional wooden-hulled sailing ships. As Cobden pointed out to his friend Abraham Poulton, the turret design allowed weapons of far higher caliber to be employed without compromising the stability of the ship. But Cobden himself was appalled to discover that the Royal Navy was still laying down wooden-hulled warships with broadside gun arrangements. His interest in technology, naval technology, I think, is proof that he wasn't, as some of his critics alleged, a believer in peace at any price. Unlike many of his Quaker colleagues in the peace movement, he wasn't a pacifist as such, but rather what Martin Keedle has termed a pacificist, a believer only in defensive wars. He was also keen to reduce government expenditure and thereby taxation at a time when military spending was by far the largest item in the state accounts. Cobden believed that many wooden warships were only being kept on the books because to retire them would involve reducing the number of officer positions available to the scions of the aristocracy. And he also deplored the waste of money on obsolete technology that wouldn't even fulfill its basic intention of keeping Britain safe from her enemies. So I think I shall leave it there with some ideas for further reading on today's topic, and I'm happy to answer questions.
You can join me. So I'd already spotted one from you. Right. So from Sean on YouTube, was the Crimean War fought to acquire control over Turkey and its resources / consolidate land with Russia? I don't remember anything about the Crimean War, unfortunately. Well, off the back of it, how far does Cobden's interpretation of the conflict square with modern interpretations of what it might all be about?
Well, certainly the Crimean War was basically fought to prevent Russia getting control of the Black Sea and the Straits of the Dardanelles, which would have then given it access to the Eastern Mediterranean, where Britain, of course, had many vital strategic interests. So, and it will also threaten the, enable the Russians to have better control over overland routes to India as well. So it's part of the kind of great game, as it comes to be known, the rivalry between Britain and Russia over. Which one are we looking at?
This one.
Right there. Better. Okay. So yeah. So basically, about giving, about control of these very strategically important areas, really. So the aim was by destroying the Russian naval base at Sevastopol, that you would retard the growth of Russian naval strength in that area. Cobden, though, saw, with an eye to history, particularly Napoleon's campaigns in Russia, and the way that, and having a sense from personal experience, because he'd travelled in Russia himself, of the vast scale of that country. Thought that really, in terms of the broader picture, how do you subdue Russia by invading this tiny bit of it in the south? He likens it to the French trying to subdue Britain by invading the Isle of Wight, famously.
Yes, Sean did have a follow-up there. Was there a real winner in the Crimean War in terms of casualties inflicted on the enemy? I think the Russians lose more, but in terms of a winner, I don't think they ever particularly emerged one.
Yeah, well, I suppose it's a kind of score draw, isn't it? Really, it's. I mean, in strategic terms, yes, it does kind of retard, the growth of Russian naval ambition. So I suppose in that strategic sense, it does what it's set out to do. It also, of course, brings the British and the French together as rather unlikely allies, having just had literally an invasion scare in 1853. Suddenly, in 1854, we're best bosom buddies with the French. In terms of the conduct of the war, of course, there's all of the gross incompetence of the British effort, particularly in that first year. And Cobden has an insight into this. One of the slides, I didn't refer to it in the lecture, but on one of the slides, there's an excerpt from a letter he wrote to Colonel Fitzmayer, who was in the Royal Artillery at the time, who becomes Cobden's main source of information for conditions on the front. So he's able to use some of the information that Fitzmayer feeds back to him in the House of Commons, explaining, the terrible conditions that the troops are having to fight in, and so on and so forth. So Fitzmayer eventually takes a lot of the letters that he sent to Cobden back, ostensibly to publish them, but I think possibly mainly to bury them.
That was one thing I was curious about, because you mentioned Fitzmayer, you mentioned other contacts in the military that let him see Fort Nelson. Do we know how they squared their role in the army with links to pacifist or pacifist movements?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think that certainly with Fitzmayer, there was a desire that the conditions in the Crimean War be known back home. I think that there was certainly that element to it. With Cowper Coles, I think that he is somebody who is trying to get government backing for his idea, for the cupola ship to modernise the Royal Navy. He's running into the sand in terms of opposition from the kind of elderly admirals who are stymieing the development of this technology, which of course does turn out to be the future of the Navy. So I think that he sees Cobden as a useful ally in pressing that message. Meanwhile, for Cobden, being able to say that he's had all this from naval officers helps him to overcome that stigma of being a pacifist and being somebody who is just a little Englander who doesn't really care about England's defence. He's showing here that actually he does care about England's defence. He just wants it to be done more efficiently and at lower cost.
Yes, that was something I was going to pick up on, was this question of masculinity. So does Cobden suffer in popular perception for being unwilling to fight, or does he take steps to re-establish his sort of presence in that respect?
That is a good question. I mean, certainly he suffers in terms of criticisms of Palmerston's foreign policy. There is this sort of attempt to portray him not necessarily as kind of weedy and effete, but certainly as somebody who is willing to side with Britain's enemies. And there's a very famous cartoon of Cobden and Lord Derby, who was the leader of the Conservative opposition after the bombardment of Canton and after the motion against Palmerston. As Chinese warriors, the Chinese warriors Derby and Cobden, as Punch puts it, with Palmerston as a kind of jolly Jack Tar rolling up his sleeves to give them both a good pasting. So in terms of enhancing Palmerston's very virile masculine image, there is certainly he's often used as a foil to that. I mean, it's quite the whole portrayal of Palmerston as this very sort of virile 50-something You know, he's portrayed as a wrestler, about to wrestle the Russian Tsar. He's portrayed as this jolly Jack Tar with all these muscles. Henry Miller has written an interesting book on sort of the political image in this period, and Palmerston at this time is in his 70s. And shortly after these cartoons come out, there are carte de visite photographs start to appear of Palmerston for the first time, showing that he's actually quite an elderly, frail-looking guy with, you know, this kind of shock of frizzy white hair. But people continue to see him in that light, though, even despite the photographic evidence in front of them that he's anything but what he's portrayed as. They start to see the glint in his eye that shows that he really is that sort of virile character. So it's an interesting illustration of how people's perceptions of political figures become quite fixed, and then once they're fixed, they're quite difficult to shift.
Yes, I should mention Palmerston cited in a divorce case, I believe, in 1863.
Yes, Mrs. Kane.
Yes.
So the joke does the London clubs that she was Kane, but was he able?
Of course, as we mentioned, Cobden isn't completely opposed to war, and I was curious how does he square his opposition to war with his support for the North during the American Civil War?
That is a very good question, and there's an interesting essay on it by a chap called Stephen Mearden in the edition that Anthony Howe and I myself edited in 2006. It's difficult, and actually in the first years or the first months of the war, Cobden is wrestling with this contradiction, because on the one hand, you have a kind of slave-holding but free trading South fighting a war against a free but protectionist North. So how do you kind of square that? And of course, you've got the North then using weapons of war, the blockade in particular, that are basically stymieing international trade and disrupting this kind of system that Cobden's trying to put in place. John Morley, when he was writing about Cobden's approved biography, if you like, in the 1880s, actually says that initially Cobden was in favour of the South because of their support for free trade. I can categorically say that is nonsense. There is no evidence that Cobden was ever pro-South, and certainly not on the grounds of free trade. In fact, he wrote a letter to the Manchester Examiner in the 1850s complaining about their support for the Democratic candidates for presidency on the grounds that he supported free trade and ignoring the fact that he supported slavery. And Cobden said to them, you cannot do this. You cannot, first of all, map on to the American party's easy positions on free trade. And secondly, even if he was a protectionist, I would still, even if he was a free trader, I would still oppose him on the grounds of slavery. So Morley got it wrong in that. But certainly it means that Cobden is very conflicted. Partly because, or mainly because, he doesn't really see a peaceful resolution to the American situation, or a military resolution to the American situation, because he thinks that given the geography of the United States, it will be impossible for the North to ever fully subdue the South. And even if they did succeed militarily, they would never win the hearts and minds of the Southern population after a brutal civil war. So it's really only after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation that suddenly gives a kind of moral impetus to the war. When Lincoln finally declares they're going to emancipate slaves in the South, that Cobden is able to fully throw his weight publicly behind the North. And quite a lot of people in Britain felt similarly, actually, that they couldn't understand why Lincoln wasn't moving to abolish slavery earlier. And that's one of the reasons why the British public were quite ambivalent about the North, at least at first.
I've got some more questions online, but I should check if there are any in the room before I go to these. Oh, yes, just over there.
In 1862, HMS Warrior was coming on the scene. Did Cobden's letters help the Navy change its mind, or do we have, if that was really happening, do we have any evidence of Cobden's view of these new ironclad Navy ships?
Well, as I adverted in the lecture, he was very abreast of developments in naval technology, and but as he was able to kind of, the fear was that when you had these new interventions, and the same thing happens with the Dreadnought, of course, in the 1900s, as soon as you've got a game-changing ship, all the other ships afloat suddenly become obsolete, and suddenly your naval rivals are not quite so far behind as you thought they were, because actually all they need to do is build 2 of those ships and they're already outnumbering you. What Cobden points out is that Britain consistently, is spending such huge amounts of money on naval armaments that she could never really, unless she was really, really incompetent, fall behind in the naval race. And that of course, is true as well in the 1900s. In fact, I think that the Clyde alone was outbuilding all of the German shipyards in the 1900s. So even without the Tyne, the Tees, the Mersey, and all the rest of it. So he is very abreast of these developments, and he is very keen that, he's a manufacturer. He knows all about technology, he knows about technological change, and he knows the impact that can have. So he's very keen to make sure that the Admiralty remain abreast of these developments, so they don't keep wasting money on ships and other equipment that are not necessary. Which is another reason why he deplores the expenditure on these huge coastal fortifications. So he's saying you could spend a tithe of that money on ironclad warships with screw propellers and rotating turret guns, and that would be a far better use of that money to make sure the French never get anywhere near Portsmouth, let alone having to defend its landward approaches. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure.
I was just wondering if the development of the Warrior was influenced by Cobden's letters.
That's much harder to prove.
It just had to be in process as a response to the American Civil War.
Yeah, I think the American Civil War had, the Admiralty are not entirely blind to the developments that are going on. So I think that, it would be a stretch to say that Cobden's letters are driving naval technological change in and of themselves. But I think certainly what he's trying to do is to achieve a greater efficiency of the distribution of resources. So if you're going to start building ironclad warships, why are you still laying down wooden hulls as well? Because that's just nonsensical.
Yeah. And just to mention, Coles actually gets to build HMS Captain, I think certainly late 1860s, presumably without his links to Cobden. He wouldn't have had the public prominence in order to do that. So yeah, there is an extent to which they're all feeding into one another, I think.
Of course, Cobden is dead in April 1865. Again, though, that was tied into his peace activities, because he'd actually come to London for a debate on the Canadian defences, and he was worried that Canada, sending more troops to Canada, might be seen as by the United States as a casus belli to start war and invade Canada. So the future of Canada was up for grabs then, as President Trump would like it to be now. There's a very interesting article actually by Mark William Palin that was published recently about that, and making comparisons to the McKinley tariff, I think, of the 1890s, that also slapped high tariffs on Canada with a view to eventual annexation, and all it did was stoke Canadian nationalism rather than actually bring them closer to America. And he was saying there's similar things going on now, so that there are parallels between the current situation and some of these historic ones. But yeah, Cobden had come to debate on Canadian defences, and sadly took ill on his arrival in London and passed away a few days later in Suffolk Street. And there's a blue plaque in Suffolk Street for Cobden now. If you go up there, it's just off Pall Mall.
So I have a question from Sanix 900 online. Were there any other sources of cotton that the UK could pull from besides the US? Well, and specifically, I guess, the Confederate States of America at that stage.
Yeah. Yes, there was, and Cobden was involved in this to a smaller degree as well. But there was a campaign that predated the Civil War, actually, to improve the cotton supply from British India as a rival source of supply to the United States. So there was a thing called the British India Society, and Cobden was very friendly with Joseph Pease of Darlington, who was one of the founders of this organisation, and they employed a lecturer called George Donisthorpe Thompson, who is actually buried in Leeds, although is in an unmarked grave currently. And Thompson had made his name as an anti-slavery lecturer in the early 1830s, and had got involved in the British India Society partly because of his anti-slavery beliefs, because the idea was to undermine the cotton plantation economy of the southern United States by promoting free labor supplies of cotton elsewhere. There was also cotton being grown in Egypt as well, I believe. So I think that there were other alternative supplies, but they couldn't scale up fast enough to replace the vast supplies that have been coming from what became the Confederate States in America. But certainly, yeah, there was an effort to try and promote that as an anti-slavery measure even before the Civil War started. And Thompson eventually ends up lecturing for the Anti-Corn Law League because he is one of the most brilliant public lecturers available at the time. So they do a kind of deal of mutual support with the British India Society so that they can get Thompson's services.
Yeah. As a point of local interest, so the mayor of Hull, Zachariah Pearson, he goes bankrupt in 1862, I want to say, because basically he's been sending ships to run the blockade to get cotton out because Hull's got cotton factories and they're running on short time. And he has so many ships taken in quick succession that he eventually goes bankrupt as a result of it. So it's just a little element of local history. I had one final question just to draw everything together. So obviously you've worked on Cobden for quite a long time, but it may just be an academic interest. As a person, based on his letters, based on what you read, do you think you would have got along?
I think I would have got along with Cobden because he was an easy person to get along with. He was very easygoing. He was very good company. His letters give a good sense of him there, and as people, I think one of the slides pointed out, the letters were like a conversation. He talked in a conversational way in them, and he wasn't intimidating. I once kind of horrified a room full of 19th century historians by saying I'd rather have gone out for a drink with Cobden than with Gladstone, but Gladstone would have been an incredibly intimidating figure. He intimidated his contemporaries. I'm sure he would have no problem intimidating the rest of us. So and very much kind of operating on a kind of much higher plane than most ordinary mortals in terms of thought and conversation. I mean, Queen Victoria, of course, famously said that the reason she didn't like him was because he talked to her like a public meeting. So he liked to harangue her rather than to Disraeli flattered her. That's why she liked Disraeli. But Gladstone tended to harangue her. But yeah, I think you could get on with Cobden, and he would be somebody interesting to talk to. Incredibly well travelled, of course, one of the most well travelled men of his age as well. I travelled through the United States twice, across continental Europe, from Spain to the Urals, and in the Near East and Egypt as well. So yeah, it would have been a very interesting person to talk to, I think.
Yes, just
in relation to Cobden being somebody who's easy to get on well with, I was wondering how well he might have got on with Giuseppe Mazzini, because fundamentally they seem to be campaigning for the same sort of thing, a Europe as a family of nations peacefully living alongside one another. But of course, Mazzini endorsed violent tactics in order to achieve that. So I'm just wondering how much interaction there might have been between the two.
Yeah. That's Mazzini for context, Italian revolutionary?
Yes, that's right. That's an interesting question because there's not an awful lot of evidence of direct contact between them, but there is a kind of Venn diagram of acquaintances and co-workers in different causes. And of course, Cobden becomes very heavily involved in the cause of the Hungarian refugees, and he does know Kossuth, the Hungarian revolutionary who comes to Britain after he's released by the Ottoman Porte in about 1851, I think. So there is contact there, and Cobden becomes heavily involved. And I've written stuff in my recent book about the way that Kossuth becomes a kind of the center of a sort of tug of war between different competing interests, as does Garibaldi, in fact, as well, when he comes over in 1864. And you get the sort of more advanced radicals who want to lay hold of him for their cause, but you also get the kind of liberal radicals like Cobden who are trying to make sure that he keeps on the straight and narrow and doesn't offend by trying to take too interventionist a line. Cobden gets in hot water about this because he makes this speech when Kossuth comes over, and he makes the point about the moral influence of Britain and says, had Britain said stop to the Russians, it would have had the force of 1,000 cannons. And some of his Quaker friends got annoyed with him about that because they thought he actually meant 1,000 literal cannons that the British would have used on the Russians had they kept going, which is not what he meant at all. He meant it in a metaphorical sense. Should have been reasonably obvious, but yeah. So it's strange to me that there's not more direct connection with Mazzini, but there certainly is with Kossuth. Yeah.
So just in terms of places to find out more, I guess if people are curious about who's Cobden corresponding with, what's he say to them? Cobdenletters.org, I think it is.
Absolutely, Cobdenletters.org. There are, as I say, 5,500 transcripts up there. They're all free to access. There are teaching materials available. There are explanatory essays. There's even a virtual exhibition of actual Cobden letters that we've sourced from about 50 odd libraries and archives worldwide. So you can actually see some of the great man's handwriting on there. So please do go and have a look at that. I have completely forgotten through all of this to plug my recent book, actually, Celebrities, Heroes and Champions, Popular Politicians in the Age of Reform, which was runner-up for the Social History Society Prize in 2023. So I've done it now.
Just in time for people to rush out and get it. Yes, so thank you very much to Simon for today's talk. Thank you also to Josh, somewhere behind the scenes, for managing the feed to YouTube, and also to Laurie here in Leeds for helping to set up. Most of all, thank you to the audience for attending, for all your questions, comments, and engagement. We would like to know how you felt about this event. There are links in the chat. There are also forms down here in person if you'd like to do this. Our next talk takes place on the 12th of March and deals with the electromagnetic railgun. Believe it or not, since the First World War, designers have been trying to make a gun powered by electromagnetic forces rather than a chemical reaction. To shed some light both on the general principles of railguns and the experimental work done in Britain in the late 1980s, early 1990s, we have retired railgun research engineer, which is a hell of a title, Derek Putley. For details of all our talks as they come up, go to our website, which is royalarmouries.org, or follow us on social media. But in the meantime, thank you very much for attending and look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time.